The second presentation is by Walker Consultants, who's been doing a study for us of residential parking study. Ms. Ridley, would you like to give us an overview?
Yeah, I guess I would just start out by saying in the fall of 2012, we approved a contract with Walker Parking Consultants to do a thorough review of the parking patterns in the residential areas around CMU's campus, with the end result to make recommendations on what the city should consider doing to impact some of those parking behaviors. So Mr. Phil Barron from Walker Parking Consultants is with us today to give you an overview of their analysis and recommendations and answer any initial questions you may have on it. Our expectation is after you've had a chance to hear his recommendations and digest his report, that we would schedule a work session in November where you can then discuss next steps that you may want to move toward for implementation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Barron and have his presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And this is one of the problems that you can jump right into. Behavioral economics is a big issue when we talk about parking often. And I just wanted to start off by introducing myself, Phil Barron, and the firm I'm with, just in case you don't know. We've been in the business for over 60 years, and we focus solely on solving parking issues. We design facilities, we repair facilities, we plan parking strategies for cities, universities, hospitals, airports. And so this is a unique field, but it's one that is in high demand with many municipalities. So Mount Pleasant and the challenges that are being faced around the university are ones that we see around the country and other college communities. And so we've brought that frame of reference to this study. I'm going to be brief, and so there's a lot of time for Q&A. The goals of our project were pretty straightforward. The overarching goal was to improve the residential neighborhoods adjacent to campus relative to the excessive on-street parking. And the core constituents, the people that we had to focus on, are residents, guests, students, and the university's faculty and staff. And those folks use the parking on a daily basis, varying degrees. So when you make a modification to one group, it often affects the other. And just to highlight our understanding of their importance, we included that group within the goals, as taking care of them. We wanted to limit traffic signage in residential areas, reduce unnecessary traffic caused by parking. There's studies that show on average 30 to 40% of traffic in urban centers is related to people searching for parking. UCLA did a study, and that's a different market, but transfer to this localized area, it could be 10 to 20% of people, of students and residents, visitors looking for on-street parking during peak times. So trying to reduce that in the neighborhoods would be a goal. Also, identifying where on-street meters should be located. There are appropriate locations, and there are locations that just don't make sense. So we looked at the area to get a better understanding of parking characteristics and where meters would be ideal. And then also looking at delivering parking services at a higher level through the technology that's available. The parking industry has made leaps and bounds from shoebox operation, cigar box operation, to highly automated parking equipment that's wireless, that allows for higher accountability, multiple ways of payment, and there's a rapid movement towards that with many municipalities. The study area that was defined for our work can be generally described as High Street to the north, Broomfield to the south, Lincoln Road west, and Mission Street to the east. The area is irregular in shape, but it represents the neighborhoods that are located proximate to the CMU campus. To provide a more focused analysis on the area, we divided it into 5 zones, and these zones are depicted up on the screen here. You can see that Zone 1 is CMU, the campus proper. We have Zone 2, the neighborhood north of campus, and that's generally the High Street to Bellows. Then we have West neighborhood, Zone 3. Zone 4 is the Orchard Glen neighborhood area. There's a mix of multi-unit residential and permanent single-occupant homes in that area. And then you have a more rural zone and Zone 5, which we're calling Chippewater area. I'm going to give a brief summary of our analysis of the current conditions for each zone, and highlighted on the screen are the takeaways. During peak conditions, what were defined, they were defined on a Tuesday during fall semester, or between the hours of 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. And 11 a.m., we identified peak conditions, and we did that by having a lot of people in the field. There were 4 people in the field doing occupancy counts throughout the day. We did it in the fall semester and spring semester, and we identified during peak conditions that 75% of the university's supply is used. And translating that to available supply, that's 2,835 unused spaces. And that's important to know because if you make a policy change that impacts neighborhood parkers that are currently in the market, you have to have a place for them to go. And so that was one of the things we first wanted to identify is what resources, what assets do we have to work with? And we spoke with the university about this, and they confirmed that these numbers are accurate. Now, the spaces that are available are not located in the core. They are located on the fringe, but they are part of the system and within a reasonable walking distance of 10 to 15 minutes to the core of campus. Zone 2, which is the north neighborhood, we identified that the demand cycle mimics the universities. And so we know that there's a large commuter student population parking there, and the residents that live in that area can confirm that as well. We identified 316 non-resident vehicles in that area. And the way we were able to identify between resident and non-resident, our folks were looking at the characteristics on an hourly basis, and you can tell when you're writing down license plates how long the cars stay and where people are walking. And so there were approximately 316 non-resident vehicles in that area. Just a commentary on the north neighborhood. It's very fragmented in the parking policies and regulations that are in place. And enforcement isn't as consistent as one would expect near a university campus where you have a lot of cross sections of users. So the ticket anxiety is relatively low. The 2-hour duration for students to park free is hard to regulate. When they arrive and when they leave, it would be hard to pinpoint without chalking tires or having somebody there on an hourly basis. So you have low ticket anxiety, free parking, competing against on-campus parking, which is highly regulated and fee-based. And then to the west of the neighborhood, you have metered parking, which is fee-based. So there's an incentive, a built-in incentive for people to park in the residential areas. Going to Zone 3, on the west residential neighborhood, there's a different dynamic there. There's a scattering of signs. Some streets have regulations, others do not. But the ones that do have signs appear to be effective, although aesthetically they aren't as pleasing as some people would like, which we can fully understand. So you have an excessive amount of signs to manage the demand. That forces the students, there are people who choose to park in there short term to find the path of least resistance, which are some side streets that don't have signage, and that just defers the problem, moves it around. We identified that the peak on-street occupancy occurred near 5 p.m., and that's when the regulations are not in effect any longer. During the peak time when the university sees their activity at the highest at 11 a.m., we identified 37 cars in that region, that area. And it's important to note that because when we're doing the analysis, we're trying to analyze, what's the magnitude of the problem? I mean, it's a huge problem to anyone who has a car in front of their home. It's a big problem. But on an aggregate, a macro level, how many cars are we seeing in that area? And so we were very focused on doing hourly counts and trying to get a good understanding of the parking characteristics, and we identified 37 cars during that time, which tells us that the signs are effective, although they may be aesthetically unpleasing. moving into the Orchard Glen neighborhood and the Chippewater area, we really identified very little on-street activity that was excessive. Specifically in the Orchard Glen neighborhood, the cars that were on street were associated with visitors to the apartment buildings within the area and service vehicles, cutting lawns, dropping off products at the residential properties. It's heavily regulated off-street for the residential apartment units. So we didn't identify a need to implement any regulation in that area. Chippewater, same thing. We looked at the perimeter, and anybody who's driven down Lincoln knows that there are an abundance of signs to deter people from parking. And it's effective. We have identified 0 cars parked on street within that region. So what does this all tell us, the current conditions? What are the primary parking issues? In Zone 2, which is the north neighborhood, we have excessive on-street parking. And the picture up there, I believe, is of I believe that is of Francher Street. Excessive parking, 2-hour regulation. We see habitual behavior, people parking there over and over. They get in a routine. They get in a pattern. That's their free option where they can park, and it creates traffic during the loading and unloading periods when classes come in and classes come out. And as I mentioned before, our data shows that there are approximately 316 non-resident cars in that area during peak weekday conditions. We look to Zone 1, and we see there's an abundance of supply, unused assets, approximately 2,800 spaces within the campus system. In Zone 3, we have excessive signage, relatively low demand on the streets, but the signage appears to be a problem. And then in Zones 2 and 3, we see inconsistent regulations. And what that translates to is essentially you have an area that's heavily regulated, and then you have an area that has no regulations. And that just defers the problem. It pushes the parking issue around. And working around at universities around the country and being a university student myself, you find the path of least resistance when it comes to parking. And you find economic incentives to park for free if you're a commuter student. And the dynamics at CMU are a little bit unique in that they have such a large commuting population. And there is commuter parking dedicated on campus, but for students that come maybe 2 or 3 times a week to campus, they will find other opportunities to park at a lower cost if it's available. And that may be in the neighborhoods. So options for consideration. Residential parking permit programs are very common around university campuses, and we're recommending that the city consider a pilot program within Zones 2 and 3. And prior to implementing any pilot program, we recommend that there be a community workshop to talk about the specifics of the pilot program. And there would be representatives from the university who are very interested in participating in such a program and lending their expertise. And then getting the residents involved, since they'll be living with the pilot program. Identify measurements to deem whether the pilot program is successful or not. Those are all important components before anything is implemented. Another option for consideration is to look at advanced on-street meter technology. There are broken meters in the area. There's a transition right now going from mechanical to digital meters within the system, but they do not take credit card or all other methods of payment other than coin. So there could be an opportunity to increase the level of service by offering digital meters. And within the report that you've been provided, the costs and payment or return on investment are provided. And so it'd be a good place right now during the transition to contact vendors and see if a pilot program could be implemented within Zone 2. There are opportunities to increase on-street parking along West Campus Drive. And one may say, why would you want to increase supply if there's an abundance of supply already, and it's not a supply-demand issue? It's more an issue of creating an alternative to the parking in the neighborhood that's low cost. You could create a sizable number of on-street spaces closer to campus, and that would create an option other than the neighborhood parking for those who want short-term parking. Also, an option for consideration is to increase the enforcement. Any policies and regulations are meaningless unless they're enforced. And parking is notorious for that demonstrating itself. People will, complain about various issues. Policies will be made, but if enforcement isn't done, human behavior won't change. You won't be able to manage the demand. And it's not about penalizing people, it's about managing the demand. And then the final item is reinvesting any revenue back into the neighborhoods. We see that lighting improvements have been made, sidewalks have been improved. Whenever there are parking policies that impact residential neighborhoods, whenever those are implemented and there's a fee-based element, we find it most acceptable to the community when money is reinvested back right where they live. So when thinking about all these policy changes, the workshop, it would be wise to talk about where the revenue goes currently and how it could potentially come back into the localized area, into the community and help. Having said all that, open for questions and comments.
Do any of the commissioners have any questions that they would like to ask at this time? A lot of information included in the report, very helpful. I mean, I haven't been able to read all 72 pages in depth, but I had looked at the recommendations, and it does give a lot of food for thought for how to handle the problems. I did want to just quickly ask, when you're talking about the residential permit, taking zone 2 and using the residential permit, particularly, for example, street like Fancher or Kinney, when you talk about residential permits being issued, and then would there be no non-residential parking on those streets, or would there be limited hours for?
I mean, that's a perfect question for workshop environment, because the programs can take on various forms. There are communities that allow first choice of purchasing a permit for residents, and then if, for example, there's a low number of permits purchased, they open them up for a higher amount to the non-residents. They also will time limit regulate them. They'll say, residential permits are in effect between 8 and 3. And then after that, it's open to the general public. So there are variations in order to cast the net wide and serve a large number of people. You just need to identify what's the core value of that neighborhood area. Is it preserving the residential accessibility and lowering the traffic during peak times? And then you design the program around that. Okay. And so we tried in the report in the back, there's examples of several different permit programs. And if you have time, you can read through it and see that they all take on slightly different variations based on the local will.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Commissioner Jocelyn.
One of the comments that I receive a lot is based on zone number 3, and that's where we're heavily signed. Did you see a trend that the signage just pushes the cars further into the neighborhood, that we sign a street and then they just pick the next available street to park, or does it stop at some point?
You know what? At Watson Street, it seems to be a natural division. We didn't see, so west of Watson was basically service vehicles, cutting lawns, things of that nature. We saw folks mainly moving closer to campus. I think along Glen, there's an unregulated area.
Right.
And really, it's not near the residential homes, but it's on it's on a traffic corridor. So we see them moving around, whether it's further we didn't see that. We saw more that we're going to see into the foreseeable future. We're not going to see an extensive growth in commuter students or various populations within the student body. It's going to remain relatively stagnant. And how that plays into it, the policies that are in place now appear to be effective for the most part in Zone 3. If it's the signs that are the issue, there are other programs that could be implemented, like a residential permit program, but there are positives and negatives with each, because the management of that is much greater than putting up signs and having it be kind of a self-regulated program where if someone's parking in front of your home and you see the sign, you can call and report them and they'll come and get ticketed, versus residential program where people have to sign up. There's some fees involved, expenses, elements that need to be managed, actively managed.
Right.
So.
Now, you had mentioned that we're going to have a work session on this in the future. Mm-hmm. Will he be back for the work session?
We can certainly try to make arrangements for that. I don't think that was part of the contract, but it may cost a little bit more to do that, but it may be worthwhile based on the...
I have a few more questions then. You said you worked with different universities over time. Is there that threshold of how far parking away from someplace? You had mentioned there's an excess of 2,000 parking spots on campus, but I think a lot of those are probably behind the football field, not by the baseball field, which I know, talking to most students, won't park there because it's too far to walk. So there's got to be that threshold. Is there a standard out there that you've come across working with these different universities? How far is too far away?
Correct. It's a great question, and it really depends on the context of the university, whether it's urban, even MSU. You think about the campus there. People arrive at MSU with an expectation that they're going to have to walk, walk far. Talking to university officials and speaking with the folks in the parking division, there's a expectation that you can park very proximate to your destination in Mount Pleasant. And that's just based on the nature of where you're at. You drive, just off of campus and you can park at your destination. So you have a cultural element that walking, 10 to 15 minutes on a campus is deemed a level of service A within the parking industry. When we look at the distance from the arena to the core area, 10 to 15 minute walking distance applies. Now, there's weather elements, there are other factors. We research the transit system that's in place, and they have capacity to take on more. They'd like to take on more. Right now, they shuttle to the off-campus housing, to the apartment buildings. But having a circulator can reduce, as long as the time between the shuttles is appropriate, because that can be a #1 complaint, is folks standing and waiting. But that's an element that reduces the walking distance. And then also, we researched and we talked, the study coincided with the master plan for the university being done, and there was this staggered timeline. So we didn't get a chance to review the final master plan, but we did have a chance to meet with the planning department, and they talked about creating walkability on campus and other elements that push parking to the fringe and make the core campus more walkable and less vehicular pedestrian conflict points. So that said, in the future, going forward, you'll see most of the parking lots requiring a walk, to the core campus, to your destination. Right now, they have small lots located in the core that are fragmented, that create, a lot of traffic on campus, and they're trying to mitigate that. So over time, when new developments happen, you may see an interior lot go away, and it would be compensated on the fringe. So the supply would remain relatively the same. They would just relocate that displaced supply. But 10 to 15 minutes, realistically, that's acceptable. The bigger driver is usually economic and not necessarily proximity. If it was free to park in the commuter lot and there was the reduction of ticket anxiety, you knew you could park there all day and not just 2 hours and hope you don't get a ticket, more people may use it. But that's a policy decision that's not me to make.
Nor ours.
Yeah.
Any other questions that any of the commissioners would like to ask? Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the work that you did with it for us. All right, that brings us to additions to the agenda.